Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with the preview video of Mstislav Rostropovich's 10 best recordings. Right now, I'm going to tell you about Rostropovich and a couple sort of stories and things, a little bit of lore from my personal experience. But if you want to know what his 10 best recordings are, you're going to have to be a ClassicsToday.com insider member, and you can sign up below. That video is over at ClassicsToday.com. So thank you all for joining, those of you who have. Those of you who haven't, you might want to consider it. Rostropovich was a marvel, a guy of just unbelievable kindness and musicality, and I mean, he was like a performing arts center in a little Russian package. He was unbelievable. I met him a couple of times. When I was in college at Johns Hopkins University, I first started doing music criticism for the radio station, of which I was classical music director, WJHU, which of course I used to parlay into free tickets to the National Symphony, of which Rostropovich was the conductor. So my primary experience of him was not as a cellist. It was as a conductor, although he quite often played the cello at those concerts. For example, I saw him do an absolutely stunning performance of the Ludoslavsky Cello Concerto in Washington at one point, and he really was a much better conductor than people give him credit for being. On disc, he was very, very smart, or the labels were smart in what they let him do. He stuck to his Russian guns. So he recorded Tchaikovsky, he recorded Shostakovich, he recorded Prokofiev. He did symphony cycles of all of those composers, plus other works. And, he did some concerto accompaniments, for example, Chopin with Martha Argerich, stuff like that. There's a wonderful story about the Chopin with Martha Argerich. I don't know who she was hanging out with at that point in her career, but apparently Rostropovich had an interest in her, as everybody apparently did. And when she turned him down, he supposedly said to a friend who told a friend who told a friend who told a friend who told me, "Why is she settling for a Volkswagen when she could have a Ferrari?" Which I think is just marvelous. Anyway, so he really conducted the usual repertoire that a music director of a major symphony orchestra would conduct, and some of it he did very well. I mean, at my college graduation, the night of my college graduation in 1983, I took my grandmother and my brother to the symphony to see Rostropovich conduct Mahler's Second, The Resurrection. And we sat in the president's box at the Kennedy Center, and it was a knockout of a performance. But he had a very wide range. Like I said, he didn't do the usual stuff. He did a marvelous Haydn Symphony Number 80 that actually had people giggling, as well it should, because it's a hilarious piece of music. He was a fine conductor, but it took him a while to get his legs as a conductor, actually. I mean, it didn't happen overnight, and we heard him train on recordings. His Tchaikovsky cycle, for example, is a little bit sloppy and heavy in places with the London Philharmonic, because that was sort of a sloppy orchestra anyway. And so he got better as he went. He really did. But even then, he could be quite variable. I mean, his Shostakovich London performances were all boring. Both the basic recorded ones and the remakes, and that was just the way it was. So, you took the good with the bad. But most of it, or a lot of it, was really, really quite astoundingly good. But so I saw him and I met him a couple times and whatnot because I was a critic. Yay. And he was always extremely cordial and funny and full of personality. And oh my God. But the most fun we ever had together was at the Cannes Classical Awards, where we gave him and his wife, Galina Vishnevskaya, the soprano, the great Russian soprano, Lifetime Achievement Awards. And that was just a blast because he brought the whole family. He came, Vishnevskaya came, his two daughters came, they all came. And, the Cannes Classical Awards, I mean, let's face it, they were not really a big deal. They were there to create some extra play for the MIDEM organization, which ran the the entire convention at which the awards took place. MIDEM stood for Marché International du Disque et Édition Musicale. It was the big music industry convention in the Palais des Festivals, where they have the Cannes Film Festival and all that, except it was in January when nobody wanted to go to Cannes. And, so we did this thing, and it was an industry insider event. But we got really, really good artists to show up because, their publicity people would do anything to get these people to get some extra publicity. So we had Rostropovich and we had Vishnevskaya. And it was really important to me, quite frankly, to do Vishnevskaya because, first of all, I read her biography, which is amazing. And second of all, because she was a very selfless person in her way. She gave up her career to save his. Because at the time that they were leaving, that they were expelled really from the Soviet Union, and then they were stripped of their citizenship, he was being tortured to death by the government. He was starting his career as a conductor, and they were only letting him conduct in the provinces. Then they would cancel the performances the night before it was supposed to happen. They weren't letting him perform because of his support of Soviet dissidents. And dissonance too, modern music, Soviet dissonance and dissidents. And so she essentially, she was the prima donna at the Bolshoi. She gave up her career to save his, and they moved initially to Paris and then partly in the U.S. and London. They lived all over the place. But so it was important to me that she be recognized because her recordings had been completely, deleted. Most of them were on Melodia, so they were persona non grata. And her Deutsche Grammophon and Philips catalog of Russian songs and Tosca and Pete Dom and things like that was all, or Eugene Onegin, I think it was. Those were all deleted as well. So I thought that was an opportunity to do something nice for her, and she really seized it, let me tell you. So he showed up, of course, his usual bouncy self, and I'll never forget. He walked up on stage to receive his award, and as he was shaking my hand because I was presenting them, he said to me, "Thank you very much for doing something for Vishnevskaya. It really meant a lot to her, and we're very, very happy." He was such that kind of a guy. He was really totally selfless when it came to those things. And he was an artist, so he's an egomaniac, but a really nice egomaniac. And afterwards, we had this wonderful dinner, this marvelous dinner, where I was sitting next to Vishnevskaya, and he was across the table, and their two daughters were over there, at the table. And he spent the whole evening telling dirty jokes, hilariously funny dirty jokes, and laughing hysterically. Vishnevskaya was talking about politics and how politicians ought to be arrested, and they can be arrested in America but not in Russia, and then she started singing to me Shostakovich's 14th Symphony while he's telling dirty jokes. That was a family portrait. It was really a family portrait. It was fascinating. But he, as a musician, Rostropovich could do almost anything. It was amazing. He played the piano. He accompanied Vishnevskaya in her vocal recitals. They did a lot of that together. And as a cellist, what can you say? The entire modern cello repertory was his. He played more contemporary pieces and commissioned or had written for him more contemporary pieces than probably any other musician alive in the second half of the 20th century. He created the modern repertoire for the cello, starting with, Prokofiev's, revised cello concerto and symphony concerto thing, and the two Shostakovich cello concertos. And after that, the sky was the limit. So he was just boundless in his musical enthusiasms and in his ability to conduct, to play, to tinkle the ivories, to do all of that stuff. What a phenomenal person. We really aren't going to see anything like that again, I think, anytime soon. He was one in a billion. And I really consider it an honor that I knew him for as long as I did. And we have these wonderful recordings. Now, the discography. What is the discography? The discography consists of, at the moment, three or four clumps, depending on how clumpish you want to be. There is a something called, now recently on Melodia, a box called Young Slava. And the Young Slava box is like 9 discs, and it's his early Melodia recordings, which he also snatched out of Russia and which were also released on Warner in their, Rostropovich Cellist of the Century 40 CD compendium. Now that compendium has all of the concerto work he did, and the Melodia stuff, but it doesn't have his conducting, which was just a missed opportunity. That was so stupid. But I know. But that's a very fine set, which of course is out of print. That's why I'm not worried about I'm going to review these things separately, these sets. I am. I've decided it's time to do them anyway, just to let you know what's in there, because there is a booklet in that set, which is marvelous, which has an entire section of works that he premiered or were commissioned or written for him. And it's like 20 discs worth of stuff. It's unbelievable. I mean, everything from Mstislav Weinberg to Brazilian people, Lopez Grassa. I mean, just unbelievable what he did. So there's all of that. Then there is his Universal stuff, which consists of things on Philips, Deutsche Grammophon, and also Decca. Now the Decca stuff came out in a separate box, his complete Decca recordings, a lot of which were done with Benjamin Britten, the cello suites and the cello symphony and chamber works, the Schubert Arpeggione Sonata, things like that, Then there was his DG chamber music recordings and his Philips chamber music recordings, including that famous Beethoven cello sonatas with Sviatoslav Richter. I mean, it's just lots of stuff, lots and lots of stuff. But as I said, he was very free in what he would play when it came to chamber music. And in cello concertos, he would play absolutely anything. At the piano, he basically limited himself to accompanying his wife or doing song recitals of various kinds. And as an orchestral conductor, when he wasn't an accompanist to a concerto soloist, he would do mostly the Russian stuff. And that's who he was. He's very well represented on this. I'm sorry they never recorded that Mahler 2. That would have been a surprise. Let me tell you, that was an explosive, fabulous performance. Probably because they had the tam-tams right at the edge of the stage, both of them, which was really very, very exciting. And I remember my grandmother, who at that point was like in her 80s, and she lived to be 103, 104, something like that. And she was hard of hearing, and we were sitting in the president's box, and when something wonderful happened, she would talk. I mean, out loud. And be like, tone it down, Grandma. And at the end of Mahler 2, he had the chorus stand up. They enter sitting down. He keeps them seated until the big ending, mit Flug on me is here wrong and that stuff. And then they all stood up. And when they all stood up, my grandmother just looked at them and went, "Holy shit!" It was great. Grandma was a character. But yeah, I mean, it was just he was one of those miraculous beings that crossed my path. And I'm just so happy it happened. So that's my own personal experience of some of Rostropovich, either in person or in concert, and some other things that there were some other things that I saw and things that I did, but that's the meat of it. And if you're interested in what his 10 best recordings are, just hie on over to classicstoday.com. Please consider signing up to become an insider, and we'll take it from there. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks so much for joining me. Take care.